My mother cried at my father's funeral. 3 days later, I found the letters. She hadn't been grieving. She'd been relieved. My mother was still wearing black when I found the first one. It was tucked inside a copy of Jane Eyre on the third shelf of my father's study, a room my mother hadn't entered in 11 years, not since the fight that broke something between them so completely that she'd stopped pretending it hadn't. I only went in there to begin the business of grief, which is really just the business of sorting through a dead man's things and deciding what gets boxed, what gets binned, and what gets kept as proof that a person once existed. I wasn't looking for anything. That's what I keep coming back to. I wasn't looking. The letter was handwritten, 3 pages, dated April 2009. The handwriting wasn't my mother's. I stood in the middle of that study with afternoon light coming through the curtains and read all 3 pages without moving, and by the time I finished, the room felt like it had changed shape. My father had been dead for 72 hours. My mother was downstairs making tea for the neighbors who'd come to offer condolences, and I could hear her voice through the floorboards, soft, appropriate, devastated. I had watched her cry at the funeral. I had held her hand. I had thought, standing at that graveside, that whatever had gone wrong between my parents in the years before, grief had burned it all away and left something pure underneath. I read the letter again. Then I sat down on my dead father's desk chair, and I started to understand that I had been living inside a story someone else had written, and I had never once questioned the plot. I should tell you who we were before I tell you what we became. My name is Claire Hendricks. I'm 34 years old. I'm a forensic accountant, which sounds dramatic, but mostly involves sitting in front of spreadsheets looking for the number that doesn't belong, the figure that someone hoped you'd overlook, the financial lie hiding inside a column of true things. I'm good at it. I notice discrepancies. It's not a talent so much as a compulsion, and it took me a long time to understand that it probably developed for a reason. My parents were Gerald and Patricia Hendricks. Married 38 years. They met in college. He was studying engineering, she was studying literature, and they built the kind of marriage that looked from the outside like the template. House in Hadley, Massachusetts. 2 kids, me and my brother Daniel, who is 3 years older and lives in Portland now with his wife and their twin daughters. Dad worked for a civil engineering firm for 30 years before he retired. Mom taught high school English until her 60s. They were not a visibly unhappy couple. That's the part that matters. They weren't cold to each other, weren't publicly hostile. They existed in the same house with the specific quiet of 2 people who had long ago stopped expecting anything from each other but had also perhaps stopped dreading anything. I had chalked this up to the natural settling of a long marriage. Most people do. There were things I'd noticed over the years and filed away without examining. My mother's habit of leaving a room when my father entered it, executed so smoothly it barely registered as avoidance. The way she volunteered for evening committees and weekend retreats with a frequency that, in retrospect, spoke of something beyond mere civic engagement. The fact that when my father was diagnosed with stage 3 colon cancer 14 months ago, my mother's response had been practical, organized. She'd arranged his appointments and his medications and his dietary changes with the brisk efficiency of someone managing a project, and I had called her a rock, and I had meant it as a compliment. I don't know what I mean by it now. Gerald Hendricks died on a Thursday. The cancer had moved faster than the oncologists expected in the final months, which is a thing they sometimes say as if it's the cancer's fault for having bad manners. He was 67 years old. He died at home, in the bedroom he'd shared with my mother for 38 years, and she was in the room when he went. I got there 20 minutes after. I know because I checked my phone. It was 11:23 a.m. when Daniel called me, and I pulled up to the house at 11:44. My mother was sitting at the kitchen table. She had already made coffee. She was very still, the way people go still when they're managing something enormous. Her eyes were dry. I remember noticing the dry eyes and thinking, she's in shock. Now I think about it differently. The funeral was on a Monday. 240 people, which surprised me. My father was a man of narrow social habits, and my mother wore a black dress I had never seen before, which meant she had bought it sometime in the preceding 14 months while he was sick. She cried beautifully. That is an awful thing to say, and I mean it exactly as it sounds. Her grief was composed, visible, and perfectly calibrated to the situation. She accepted hugs. She said, "He was a good man," 4 times that I counted. She held my hand at the graveside, and her hand was trembling, and I felt the tremble and believed it. I am trained to find the number that doesn't belong. I did not find it at my father's funeral. I found it 72 hours later, in a copy of Jane Eyre, on the 3rd shelf. The letter was from a woman named Margaret O'Say. She had a clear, confident handwriting, the kind you develop if you grew up in a household where penmanship was considered a character indicator. She addressed my father as Gerald, not Jerry, which was what my mother called him, what everyone called him, Gerald. I'm not going to reproduce the full letter here because some of what it contained is not mine to share. but the broad shape of it was this. Margaret Osei had been my father's colleague at the engineering firm for 6 years. Something had developed between them. The letter did not specify its nature with precision, which may have been intentional. She was writing in April 2009 to tell him that she was leaving the firm, that she was leaving the state, and that she thought it was best for everyone. She wished him well. She told him to take care of himself. She said, "You deserve to be known by someone. I hope someday you are." I put the letter face down on the desk and stared at the opposite wall. You deserve to be known by someone. That line. Because the thing that hit me, not the relationship, whatever it had been, but that line was what it implied about my father's life, about what someone who had known him, really known him, had assessed as the central tragedy of Gerald Hendricks. Not that he was unfaithful or weak or reckless, but that he was unknown, that he had lived inside a marriage where his wife did not know him or did not wish to. I went back to the bookshelf. I pulled out every book on the shelf. There were 6 more letters. I did not tell Daniel immediately. I want to be honest about that. I sat with those 7 letters for 48 hours before I told a single person, and in that time I did what I do. I built a picture. The letters spanned from 2007 to 2016. 4 were from Margaret Osei. The last one from her was postmarked Chicago, 2009, which aligned with what she'd said about leaving. The other 3 were from different people. 1 man, 2 women, none of whom overlapped in time, all of whom used that same slightly formal register with my father, Gerald. None of them salacious, none of them what you'd call explicit. They were the letters of people who had been close to my father in ways that his marriage did not accommodate. The question I kept arriving at was not, why did he do this, but what was he doing this instead of? I found the answer in the 7th letter, which was the most recent, dated March 2022, which was 11 months before his diagnosis. This one was different from the others. It was from my father, unsent, a draft, 3 pages in his handwriting, addressed to no one. I think he wrote it to himself. It was the most honest document I have ever read, and in it, among other things, he described his marriage, not with bitterness, not with blame, but with the exhausted clarity of a man who had run out of the energy required to maintain a fiction. He said that Patricia had told him, sometime around 2003 or 2004, that she had stayed for the children and intended to continue staying, but that he should not expect more from her than what she was willing to give. He said he had accepted this because he did not know what else to do, and because on some level he believed he deserved it, though he was no longer sure what for. He said, "I have spent 20 years being grateful for a woman who regards me as an obligation." I put the letter down. I went to the kitchen and stood at the sink and turned the cold water on, and stood there with my hands under it until I couldn't feel them anymore. 20 years. I was 14 in 2003 or 2004. I had been living in that house. I called Daniel on a Wednesday evening. He answered on the 3rd ring, sounding exhausted. The twins were 18 months old and he was running on nothing. And I said, "I need to talk to you about something and I need you to be sitting down." He sat down. I told him about the letters. Not all of them, not yet, but enough. The letter from Margaret, the draft, the thing Dad had written about Mom telling him she'd stayed for the children. Daniel was quiet for a long time. "I knew something was wrong," he said finally. "I always knew something was wrong. Why didn't you say anything?" "Because what would I have said? Hey, Mom, you seem to tolerate Dad. That's not a conversation." "She cried at the funeral, Dan." "I know. She was in the front row. She cried." Another silence. "What do you want to do?" I didn't have an answer for that yet. So I said I'd call him when I did, and I hung up. And I did 2 things that night that would matter later. The first was that I photographed every letter with my phone and sent the files to my personal email and to a cloud folder I created for this specific purpose. The second was that I called Dr. Renata Solis. Renata Solis had been my therapist for 4 years, a licensed clinical psychologist, 15 years practicing, with a specialty in family systems and complex trauma. She was the calmest person I had ever encountered in any setting, and I needed calm the way you need oxygen when you've been underwater too long. I called her at 8 p.m., which was outside office hours, and she picked up because I had only ever done that once before and she knew what it meant. I told her everything. It took 45 minutes. When I finished, she said, "How are you feeling right now, physically?" "My chest is tight," I said, "and my hands keep going numb." "Okay, that's your nervous system in overdrive. I want you to do the following." She walked me through a grounding exercise I had done with her before, the kind where you name 5 things you can see and 4 you can touch and so on. I did it. The tightness in my chest loosened a fraction. "The question you're circling," she said, "is whether to confront your mother." "Yes. And you're scared of what she'll say." "I'm scared of what she won't say." "Tell me what you mean by that." "I'm scared she'll confirm all of it calmly. I'm scared it won't be a confession. It'll just be a statement of fact, like she's been waiting for someone to bring it up so she can finally put it on the table." Renata was quiet for a moment. That fear tells you something important about how you understand your mother. I know. What do you want from the conversation if you have it? I had to think about that for longer than I expected. I want her to understand that I know. I want her to know that I know who my father actually was, not the version she decided he was. And I stopped. Take your time. I want her to say she's sorry, not to me, to him, even if he can't hear it. I want to see if she's capable of it. I did not go to my mother immediately. I needed more than letters. This is where I have to acknowledge something that might make me sound cold. I am a forensic accountant. The instinct, when faced with evidence of a hidden truth, is not to confront. It is to document, to build a case so airtight that denial becomes impossible. I reached out to two people. The first was Eleanor Marsh, a family law attorney I had worked with on a case 3 years prior, 16 years practicing, sharp as a paper cut, the kind of lawyer who reads documents the way other people watch thrillers. I didn't need legal representation, I told her. I needed to understand whether the letters had any bearing on my father's estate, which was still being processed. Specifically, whether my mother's behavior during the marriage, if it could be characterized in the way my father's draft letter characterized it, had any relevance. Eleanor reviewed the photocopies I sent her. She called me back within an hour. These letters wouldn't alter the estate, she said, but I want to be direct with you about something. The draft letter, the one he wrote himself, describes what's sometimes called a controlled separation within marriage. Essentially, a unilateral withdrawal by one spouse under conditions that could constitute emotional withholding. In a legal context, this is rarely actionable, but in a human context, she paused. Your father appears to have described a situation that many would consider a form of sustained coercion. She told him to stay grateful, I said. Basically, she told him his role was to be managed. That's one reading of it. What's another reading? Silence. I don't have one that's kinder. The second person I contacted was James Whitfield, who had been my father's closest friend for over 30 years, retired now, a former high school principal, one of those steady men who seem to exist specifically to be trusted. He was one of the 240 at the funeral, had hugged my mother for a long time, had given a brief, dignified eulogy about my father's integrity. I asked to meet him for coffee. He arrived at the cafe on Elm Street at 10 a.m. on a Friday, ordered a black coffee, and settled across from me with the careful expression of a man who knew that when a grieving woman asks to meet you alone a week after the funeral, it is not to discuss fond memories. I put the letters on the table. I didn't say anything. I just put them there. He read them, all 7. He took about 12 minutes. When he finished, he set them in a neat pile and put his hands flat on the table. He told you? I said. No. James looked at his coffee. But I knew. He didn't tell me the specifics. But I knew your father was a man living under something heavy, and I knew it wasn't the kind of heavy you bring out in conversation easily. He looked up. Your mother, Patricia, she's a very controlled person. I know. There were things she said over the years. Small things. The way she'd talk about your father in the third person when he was in the room. The way she'd redirect conversations when he started to open up at dinner parties. He shook his head slowly. I told myself it was just her personality. Some people are like that. But Gerald once said something to me. This was maybe 6-7 years ago. He said, James stopped, pressed his lips together. He said, she has never once been curious about me, Jimmy. In 30 years, she has never asked me a question she actually wanted the answer to. I excused myself to the bathroom. I stood over the sink for 3 minutes. When I came back, I was ready. I went to my mother on a Sunday afternoon, 16 days after my father's funeral. I brought the letters in a folder. I did not bring Daniel. He'd offered. But this felt like something that needed to happen in a specific way, with specific witnesses, and Daniel was not in a state to be neutral. My mother was in the sitting room when I arrived. She'd changed out of the black. She was in a gray cardigan, gray trousers, a string of pearls at her throat. She looked composed. She looked almost rested. She asked if I wanted tea. I said no. I sat across from her, and I put the folder on the coffee table. I found these in Dad's study, I said. I've read all of them. She looked at the folder. Her expression did not change, exactly, but something shifted in it. A subtle recalibration, the way a person's face moves when they've just located the exit in a room they thought they knew. Where did you find them? She asked. Inside Jane Eyre, 3rd shelf. A small pause. He kept them, she said, quietly, almost to herself. You knew about them. I knew about Margaret, she said. The others I suspected. I didn't look. She folded her hands in her lap. I didn't want to look. Why not? She met my eyes. Because then, I would have had to do something about it. Something that had been sitting in my chest for 16 days, shifted and settled into a new shape. He wrote something, I said. A letter he never sent, to no one. He wrote about what you said to him, around 2003, 2004, about staying for the children, about what he should and shouldn't expect. My mother was very still. He said he spent 20 years, I said, being grateful for a woman who regarded him as an obligation. The silence in that room was the loudest thing I've ever sat inside. That's not, she stopped. Started again. That's not entirely fair. No, it's not as simple as he made it sound. Then explain it to me. What followed was 40 minutes of conversation that I am still, months later, processing. I'm not going to give you all of it because parts of it belong to my mother's private history in ways I'm not willing to publicly excavate. But the shape of it was this. My mother had been unhappy in her marriage for a long time. She had not been unhappy because my father was cruel or absent or abusive in any recognizable sense. She had been unhappy, she said, because she had married at 23 expecting a particular kind of life, and the life she got, while not bad, was not it. And somewhere in her 40s she had made the calculation that leaving would cost more than staying, and so she had stayed and she had managed. She used that word, managed, as if my father were a logistics problem. He wasn't a bad man, she said. I know he wasn't. He was just... She made a small gesture. He and I were very different people. He knew that, I said. He wrote that. He understood it better than you seem to. I looked at her. What I want to know, and I need you to actually answer this, is whether you feel anything now that he's gone. Whether there's anything underneath the managing. She was quiet for a long time. I feel, she said carefully, relieved. There it was. Not grief, not guilt, not the complicated tangle of loving someone imperfectly for 38 years. Relieved. The tears at the funeral, the neighbors in the kitchen, the appropriately devastated expression. All of it had been real in its way, I believe, because my mother is not a liar in the conventional sense. But the thing underneath it, the thing she'd been carrying and could now put down, was not loss. It was the end of an obligation, and she was glad to be done. I drove home in a state I can only describe as very quiet and very full. No tears. I think I'd spent most of them on the office floor of a dead man's study, just the specific heaviness of something understood. I called Daniel. I told him what she'd said. He didn't say anything for a while. She said relieved, he said finally. Yeah, out loud. She said that word. She did. A long exhale. What do we do with this? I don't know yet, I said, but I know what I'm going to do first. What I did first was call Renata. What I did second was write a letter, not to my mother, not to Daniel, to my father, handwritten, 3 pages, the way Margaret Ozey had written to him in 2009. I told him what I'd found, and what I'd done with it, and that I'd read every word he'd written to no one, and that I'd understood it, not as proof of his failures, but as proof of his interior life, his real one, the one that had managed to persist for 38 years under the specific gravity of being managed. I told him I was sorry it took me this long. I told him I knew him now, even if I couldn't tell him that to his face. I told him I thought he deserved to be known. I drove to the cemetery on a Tuesday morning, left the letter folded under a stone at the base of the marker. It rained the next day, and I assumed the paper dissolved, which felt right. Some things aren't meant to be kept. Some things just need to be said. I want to tell you there was a reckoning, a formal one, that my mother faced some consequence commensurate with 38 years of emotional withdrawal, with telling a man to be grateful for her endurance, with crying at a funeral for a husband she was relieved to be free of. There wasn't, not in any legal or public sense. She is my mother. She is 71 years old. She did not break any law. She was, in her own estimation, doing what was necessary. And maybe she was, in some accounting system I don't have access to. What happened instead was smaller and more lasting. Daniel and I had a conversation with her in January, 3 months after the funeral, back at the Hadley house, at the kitchen table where she'd made coffee while my father's body was still upstairs. We brought the letters. We brought the draft. We sat with her for 4 hours. We did not accuse. We did not perform an intervention. We just asked her to look at it. To look at the actual document of his inner life, the one he'd written to himself in the dark, and to tell us what she saw. She read it slowly. When she finished, she set it down. She did not cry, but she said, and I believe she meant it, because my mother, for all her faults, is constitutionally incapable of performing an emotion she doesn't have. She said, I didn't know he felt it this deeply. He didn't have anywhere to put it. I said, no, she said, I suppose he didn't. It wasn't an apology. I don't know if she's capable of one or whether I'd entirely trust it if she gave it, but it was an acknowledgement, a recognition. The first time, I think, that she looked at my father as a person with an interior life rather than a variable in her own equation. It wasn't enough. It was something. I have my father's notebook now. Not the unsent letter that dissolved in the rain where it belonged, but a small notebook I found in his desk drawer, separate from the letters. He'd been keeping it for at least 10 years. It's not a journal exactly, more like fragments, things he'd noticed, things he'd thought, some quotes he liked, some descriptions of things he'd seen. There's a line in it from near the end, dated maybe 8 months before the diagnosis. It says, the cardinal in the backyard comes every morning. Patricia never mentions it. I've started to believe I'm the only one who can see it. I put the notebook in my bag and I carry it with me. My father spent 38 years in a house where no one was curious about him, where the cardinal outside the window was his alone. I am curious about him. I'm finding him in pieces now, from James Whitfield's stories, from the notebook, from the letters he received, and the one he wrote to himself. I am building a picture of a man I thought I knew, reconstructed from the evidence he left behind for no one. He was a good man. He was more than that, though. He was a specific man, with a specific interior life, with a cardinal he watched every morning and a study full of books and words written in secret to people he couldn't keep, and words written to himself that he couldn't say out loud. He deserved to be known. He is now, just not in time to know it.